Hi, I know I've talked about this some time ago, but tomorrow's my birthday, and I want to talk about it again. Judith is a story. It didn't really happen. In fact, the first paragraph of the book of Judith says that this is a story of this time and this time and this. It mixes up all the time. So it alerts the reader who would know that it's a story, but it's an important story. In the passage that we heard, I should like to point a few things out. The Assyrians under General Holofernes, fighting for King Nebuchadnezzar, had camped in the valley. They were a force too many to count, like locusts or the dust of the earth, as they seized lands on their march to Jerusalem. 170,000 infantry and 12,000 horsemen camped in the valley below Bethulia. Towns and cities had already surrendered to the Assyrians, and Holofernes showed no mercy to them. So all of Israel was crying out to God to save them. And Holofernes would boast, "What God is there beside Nebuchadnezzar? He will send his force and destroy them from the face of the earth. Their God will not save them." Now, the village of Bethulia lay on the way to Jerusalem on a hill. To get to Jerusalem, you had to get through Bethulia. And isn't it interesting, I don't know if you caught this, in the valley where the Assyrians camped, in the mountain region, they blocked the water to Bethulia. In other words, the water could not flow up. But this is the story. Bethulia was bone dry, no water, all the springs dried up, no water was coming from down there. And the people were thirsty, dying of thirst, collapsing in the streets, and they urged their rulers to surrender. The elders decided that they would hand the town over if God did not rescue them after 5 days. Do you hear that, God? 5 days. They got it in their heads that God was punishing them for some sort of sins. For water represents the Spirit of God. That's why we get baptized with water. And the people of Bethulia believed that, and they had no water, and they believed that must be because of some sin on their part. So they got dressed up in sackcloth and ashes as penance. Even the animals dressed up in sackcloth and ashes. Still, Bethulia remained bone dry, and they felt abandoned and lost. Now, there was a wealthy widow in town. Her name was Judith, and we first find her, like Snoopy, sitting on her rooftop. She was mourning her husband, and she wore sackcloth too, but for that mourning. She eventually hears about the drought from her maid. Did it affect her? And she goes to the elders and she says, "Never fear, I am here and I will help you." That's a rough translation. She also scolded them because they were going to surrender to the Assyrians. And she says, "No. Trust me. You cannot lay down conditions for God." And they did trust her. She went back home and took a bath. A bath. Remember, there's no water in Bethulia. What's that mean? And she dressed herself up in fine array and jewels, and she prayed to God for help. "For you," she prayed, "are the God of the lowly, the helper of the oppressed, the supporter of the weak, the protector of the forsaken, the savior of those without hope." Now that's throwing down a dare to God. Judith and her maid went down to the Assyrian camp. They carried some clothes. They carried a sack containing food and provisions for several days. The Assyrian guard stopped them, of course, but Judith pretended to be just tired of her village for holding out. She wanted to honor Holofernes. She would show them a good way to Bethulia, too. So they took her to Holofernes' tent. They let her go in to see the general with her maid, and they were carrying a heavy sack. Well, no worries. She flattered him, and Holofernes was delighted. He assigned her a tent where she could stay with her maid. He assigned her a tent where she could stay with her maid. Worth repeating. For 3 evenings, Judith and her maid would go outside the camp to pray, they said. And at first they watched what they did, but that's what they did. Judith and her maid went out and prayed, and they came back. For 3 nights they did this, earning the trust of the army and the general, and they believed that she was indeed one of them. On the 4th day, Holofernes wanted to give a banquet. He insisted that Judith join them. And Holofernes drank a lot of wine, more than he had ever drunk in a day, and it grew late. The servants withdrew, and Holofernes was drunk and just lying on his bed. Judith went over to Holofernes' bed, and she took his sword. She drew close to the bed, grasped the hair of his head, and said, "Strengthen me this day, O God of Israel." Then she struck him twice in the neck and cut off his head. She handed the head to her maid, who put it into the food bag, and they went off to pray past the guards. By now, the guards knew Judith and her maid were going to pray, and so they didn't pay any attention. But this time, Judith and her maid did not stop. They climbed back up to Bethulia, and there they called out all the people. Judith displayed Holofernes' head, which encouraged the people, and the men of the village armed themselves and rushed down to the camp. Meanwhile, the guards had discovered that Holofernes was dead, and they were in complete confusion. So the Bethulians took them by surprise, and they won. And after that, there was feasting and fun, and the last chapter of the book, which Jeff read part of, is the Song of Judith. She didn't sing it. The Bethulians did, while they were feasting and having fun and praising her. And so ends the story. Judith and her maid had saved Bethulia and also Jerusalem. And I know I've spoken about this some time ago, that in my days as a Catholic, during the feasts of Mary, and there are so many feasts of Mary, there was always a reference to Judith. And I never knew what that meant. I never looked Judith up, which I could have, because the Catholic Bible has Judith's story, but the Protestant Bibles don't. That's another thing. Anyway, the Catholic Church connected Judith with Mary, and it took me a little time to realize why. There were women who had somehow destroyed a monster, often by doing some damage to the monster's head. And I know I've gone over this before, but this is one of my favorite things. Back in the book of Genesis, while scolding Adam and Eve, God says that someone will be coming who will crush the serpent's head. The serpent who could be Satan, who attempted Eve to eat the forbidden apple, and she did, and gave a bite to Adam, and because of that, according to God, we are all born with original sin and have to suffer. Talk about an overreaction, maybe. And the text is, it's Genesis. Most Bibles have God say to that nasty serpent, "He," meaning the Redeemer who is coming, "shall crush your head." But some Bibles say, "She shall crush your head." Mostly the "she" ended up in Catholic Bibles, and that goes back to a translation of St. Jerome, back from the years 350, when he was translating the Bible from Greek to Latin. And that was the Bible the Catholic Church placed above all others. And that was the Bible I grew up with. And I was told that Judith was connected to the Blessed Mother Mary. Other Bibles will say, and probably the one in your pew will say, "He shall crush your head." And that reference, the church assumes, means Jesus, the Redeemer. But she shall crush your head, is what Jerome wrote. And because there were hundreds of years between Jerome's translation and the Protestant Reformation, it was she shall crush your head for a lot of years. So the Redeemer is a woman, and that is why in churches with statues of Mary, Mary has her foot over a serpent's head. Anyway, she shall crush your head in Genesis foresees women heroes in the Bible, among them Rahab of Jericho, who hid the Hebrew spies when they were organizing to conquer Canaan. Deborah, a judge who served during a lawless time, and under her reign, Israel enjoyed 40 years of peace. Ruth, a brave and faithful ancestor of Jesus, Hannah, who prayed faithfully for a child for years and became the mother of the prophet Samuel. Esther, a Hebrew who as queen and wife of Xerxes, king of the Persians, saved her people. Miriam, Moses' sister, who gave courage to the former slaves, singing as they traveled to the land God promised them. And of course, the Marys, Jesus' mother and Mary Magdalene. And remember, Jesus' mother sang, God has scattered the proud in their conceit. God has cast down the mighty from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich God has sent away empty. And let's give Eve some credit for starting it all, for reaching out for that apple. As some of you know, I go to Yosemite a lot. I was in Yosemite at one point some years ago when I listened to a lot of native stories told by a member of the Washoe tribe. And those stories were dry, but they were very funny. And I went back to San Francisco after that with all that in my head, and I was at St. Mark's Cathedral, and I listened to someone read the story of how Eve, rebellious Eve, reached out for that apple. And as the woman in the chapel read it, I was thinking, this is really a funny story. And I'm laughing, and everyone else is looking pretty grim, because, hey, this is a story about original sin after all, but it's funny. Whether we believe in the stories or not, there is a truth that courageous and faithful women brought about victory, freedom, and salvation in many of these Bible stories, and with some humor. And there's always a time when women step forward to say, no to some power. I'm sure we can think of many. Some, George Sand, Marie Curie, Victoria Woodhull, Harriet Tubman, Coretta Scott King, Helen Keller, Katharine Hepburn, there's a story, Winona LaDuke, Emmeline Pankhurst, Rosa Parks, Malala Yousafzai, even little Ruby Bridges, surrounded by federal marshals, walking to first grade. Like Judith and many others, we must be clever and persistent in seeking to disempower those who seek to hurt others for their own benefit, and to persist in courage and energy to remember who we are and who our God is. Even in small ways, one could hope for a time, yes, when the girls and women of the world can rest. Let us hope that it can come soon, and that the world can feast and dance and sing and celebrate. Women with courage, insight, wisdom, and humor. And there's no shortage of them, even in these pews and on Zoom. So, what's there left to say?